Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of your summer course, the Rhetorical Tradition and Contemporary Applications, Column 350. If that's not the course you're supposed to be in, let's figure that out, okay? For those of you who are supposed to be here, which I assume is 100%, welcome. And I hope that you will get used to perhaps this background a little bit, but also to the fact that every time you see me, my hair may be a different color, a different length, etc., because I will be posting videos that I have recorded in the past, and I tend to change my hair a lot. So I do apologize that you will see me in various stages honestly, of health and of growth and of everything else. Just know that with a name like the Rhetorical Tradition and Contemporary Applications, not a lot changes, right? This is not a scientific field that it needs to be updated all the time. It's not social media driven or digital driven. Aristotle's been dead for pushing 3,000 years now. So, it's not really something that we have to update too often. And that means that we can recycle a lot of our lectures. And I don't like to do that. So you'll notice I'll only use a lecture that is at maximum 2 years old, just because I need to remember what I said to you as well. And that leads us to the question about the syllabus, I'm sure, which is I've heard horrible things about this course. Are they true? The answer is yes, absolutely. There's a ton of reading. It's boring. I have found the cure to insomnia. It's called this book, but I have been using it pretty much the whole time that I've been here. And since teaching this since 2006, I've learned a few things about what you all, at least past students, have found useful and helpful, and what people are still using in their work, their lives post-graduation. So I've learned to sort of hone that for you. The fact that I trimmed it down to 8 weeks for a summer course actually hasn't damaged the course all that much. I mean, yes, there's less content in a lot of ways, but really the main ideas, the trends, and the course goals, which are listed there in your syllabus, are the same. And what are those course goals? Well, one of the first things that we need to do is learn about what theory is and what rhetoric is, right? Those two things are incredibly important if we want to understand the rhetorical tradition or the theorizing about persuasion, okay? And one of the reasons for needing to know that, one of the reasons that's one of the course goals, is because it underscores all of the learning that you've done up to now, no matter what type of communication or context we're talking about, with the exception of interpersonal and most small group communication. Whenever you're talking about mass persuasion at any level, public persuasion at any level, you're talking about the very ancient practice of rhetoric. So that's one of the reasons why that goal is so important, just understanding theory and rhetoric. We'll also learn about changes and developments in rhetorical theory over time. So we'll be doing this chronologically. Hopefully that helps a little bit with the sorting of things as you're trying to wrangle a bunch of old dead guys, which is essentially what we're doing. We have managed to include a few women that we have learned more about, and really persons of color and other culture and lower classes are not heard from, essentially, until much later, much more recent times. So sorry about that, but that's the way it is, unfortunately. And we're going to have to keep that in mind as we go through this, that we're looking at it with a 2020 vision. That's very different, and I mean that literally, since it's 2021. Now, I do have incredibly bad jokes. I do apologize for that. Another thing that I want you to understand by the time you're done with this class, another course goal, is understanding theory and its link to criticism. And then also a course goal is to make sure that you're able to write in APA style a formal, presentable paper. So a scholarly paper, an academic paper. So it's a formal paper. This is not a fly-by-the-night essay this final paper, the second paper that you're going to do, is going to be something that we might share with my colleagues. Something that is scholarly in nature, but is on something that you're interested in. Now, I know you're going to rush and read what the paper assignments are. Some of you will have ideas that you're going to get it done very quickly, and you may. Some of you will. Some of you do that, and that's great. I am a procrastinator, and that has not been a good endorsement for procrastination, let me tell you. But those of you who are on the ball and wanting to get it done like right now, I know you're going to go read those paper assignments because I did put them up. And you should feel free to go do that. We only have 8 weeks together. The first paper is simply expository. It's just you telling me about some part of the first few weeks of rhetoric that we're talking about. That is detailed on the assignment, as well as your paper 2, which is actually what we would call a rhetorical analysis, or rhetorical criticism, where something that you have in your life that you encounter fascinates you, interests you, makes you question something, and that's what we're going to study. So perhaps it's a song lyric. Why is this popular? Which is something I ask myself all the time. I am such an old lady now. I'm like, get off my lawn, and why am I watching this TV show? Those two things seem to come into my mind a lot, metaphorically at least. But when I watch television or I watch a movie, especially, I get very depressed sometimes with how little content there is. But then other times I'll watch something that is seemingly just horrible. One of my current obsessions is the TV show The Boys. It's actually not a TV show so much as it's a Prime Video show. So there's a lot of things they can get away with: the swearing, the violence, the sex, all of it. And it's a disturbing television show in a lot of ways, a serial. And I keep watching it. And I got through both seasons that are available, and I thought, why am I doing this? And some of you might be thinking, well, because, Jensen Ackles is going to be in it in season 3. And of course that's why. And some of you are like, who the heck is Jensen Ackles? Because he's my age. And he's one of my favorites because the TV show Supernatural was, right? One of the reasons I loved Supernatural was because being raised Catholic in the Northeast, moving here, questioning good and evil is something that we do regularly. Walking around with a ton of guilt is something that people like myself do regularly. And so watching that show gives me an opportunity to sort of see different views of and interpretations, and they're radically fictional, right? Interpretations of good and evil, good and bad, and how that works in society. And I can get behind that. I can get behind killing vampires and werewolves and hanging out with angels and demons. I can get behind that. That's easy for me to imagine. But when I watch The Boys, I'm like, what is happening? Why am I watching this? And a lot of times I'll go onto forums, online forums, where people are like, oh, well, the reason that this is so interesting is this, this, and this. And I'm like, I hadn't thought of that. Still not interesting. And so there's some reason that drives me to watch that show. And I'm not really sure what it is. One of those things that I might do in order to figure that out is to take different perspectives and critically think about what that show is telling me. What are the messages that I'm receiving based, if I look at it from a feminist point of view, if I look at it from a power point of view, if I look at it for the general persuasion from Aristotle? I probably wouldn't be able to do that, but it would be an interesting quest. Maybe I find an argument in there that's being made and advocated for it. I analyze that. Some way of looking at it that will give me an answer to the question, why do people like this television show? Now, I'm not going to get the real answer why, but I am going to get a critical answer. That is to say that after spending time with it and look at it from different perspectives, I'm going to have an answer to why I watch this TV show. Some of you might be thinking, oh, yeah, I know this song that I listened to, and I was singing it for like 10 years before I realized what it was really about. It happens to me all the time. Not too long ago, I was sitting in my apartment as a single person, and I was listening, me and my cat, and I was getting ready to go to a club, and me and my cat are sitting there, and we're listening to Love the Way You Lie by Rihanna and Eminem. And I'm like, why am I singing this song? Like I knew every word. And that was really disturbing. That was really disturbing because if you know anything about that song, it's not exactly a happy-go-lucky piece of work. It's pretty traumatizing in a lot of ways. But the point is that sometimes we say things, we repeat things, we sing things, and we're like, what are we doing when we realize what it's really about? And those are the things I find the most interesting for myself when I'm doing a rhetorical criticism. You all will be doing the same thing. So maybe you have something in your life already that fascinates you, that you have questions about, that you want to look at, that you want to analyze, that you want to let me know about, etc. And this will be a piece of cake for you. For those of you who are thinking, oh my God, what topic would I possibly do? Well, I'm going to give you some sample papers and we'll talk about some sample topics and hopefully help you work on something that is useful to you, as well as demonstrating a knowledge and achieving the course goals that we have set forth in the syllabus on the front page. So how are we going to reach those goals? We're going to start today. We're going to start by talking about essentially a large timeline, and I'll be posting some pictures of the timeline, or at least some sort of graphic for the timeline for you, but you should outline the lectures that you're going to be seeing. The reason for that is I don't provide an outline. I don't provide PowerPoint slides, because if I did that, you wouldn't listen to the lectures, you wouldn't absorb them auditorially, visually, and then of course writing things down always helps us learn. And you're thinking, why do I need to learn anything when I can just Google the answers for the test and write a paper? And that is certainly a valid question, unless you want to really dig in and learn something about this. So there are two ways to approach this class. One is to go in with it being like, okay, I just have to get through this and pass it to get through this degree program. That's certainly one way to do it. People have done it before. The second way to do it is to say, hey, I'm going to have a little bit of fun with this and take the pressure off yourself and try to enjoy some of the things we talk about. I say before I start the first lecture, which is by far the worst. So your book is, this is actually the second edition I have down here. I didn't realize I had only brought the second edition down to my office, but hopefully you found the third edition. It is called The Rhetorical Tradition and Contemporary Applications. This is called The Rhetorical Tradition, Readings in Classical Times to the Present. It is by two people named Bizel and Hertzberg. I think that's backwards for you, and I apologize, but Bizel and Hertzberg, I'll make sure that this is, believe it's on the syllabus, but if it's not, I'll make sure that I get it out to you all. And hopefully you've got that book, because we are going to be doing a lot of reading. Not as much as I do in a regular full-size semester of 16 weeks, but we are going to be doing a lot of reading. This, as you know, an online class, I know you guys think it's easy for us, and it's harder on you. That's partially true about certain aspects of the course, but other things are harder on us. For example, I don't get to see you right now. I have no idea if you're responding positively or not. I don't like being online. I prefer to be in the classroom. I haven't been in the classroom since March of 2020. I miss it. I miss seeing you all. I miss having conversations. But there are ways for us to make up for that. And we will also I will offer some sessions where I'm available to you live via Zoom. And if you want to take me up on that, feel free. You can ask me anything you want. We could talk about whatever you want to talk about. And we could do this as a large group, as a small subset group, as individuals. It's entirely up to you. Okay. So whatever's going to help you learn best. And without any more than that, I think reading, exams, a few small assignments, you'll have plenty of time to do these things. And then the two papers, which you already know about. Again, ignore the due dates on the papers. You may turn those papers in anytime before the last week of class. I say the last week because I need days to grade the papers. And if I get, 35 papers all in the last week, or double that, 70 papers, I obviously can't grade even 1/3 of that in a couple of days. I'm going to need more time than that. So I would encourage you to turn your first paper in sooner rather than later, but that's just me. I know you all have different schedules, different lifestyles, and may not be able to do everything on a set schedule, but on your own schedule. Hopefully this course will allow for that. The reading schedule that I've set up for you is for you to read on your own schedule. I did it by week, essentially. And I did notice recently when I was looking at your syllabus just a second ago, I'm looking at it on my phone because I can't do it on my computer at the same time, which is just one of those quirks about this computer. But I believe some of the dates after June 14th through 18th are wrong. I completely missed June 21st through the 24th and 25th and a few others. So I apologize for that, but you'll get the general idea. If you look at it as week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, all the way up to week 8, you'll be just fine. Now, I give you that reading schedule just as a suggestion. If you read on that reading schedule, you are guaranteed to know everything you need to know by the time of the exams and by the time that you would turn in papers. So that's why I put a reading schedule there. I'm not going to be checking in and quizzing you every week on all of that reading. That's nutty. We will focus on what's in the book and what we talk about in lecture a lot more than anything else. There may be some questions on the exam that come from lecture and some that come just from the book, but for the most part, we're going to talk about the things that I think are important, and those are obviously the things I'm going to test you on. As I said, I'm not going to focus on minor details. I'm going to be focusing on the major trends and changes in rhetorical theory and criticism that I want you to know. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I don't see any reason to mess around with tiny little minute details. For example, when somebody lived and when they died. That's not important as far as the years are concerned, as much as the context of the time period that they lived in. And so that's what we're going to talk about actually here in this first lecture before I start posting specific theorists. Now, as I said, I do this chronologically, and I basically take it theorist by theorist chronologically. And we look at these sort of trends that come from these theorist thoughts, these philosophers. We look at those trends over time rather than looking too deeply into specific things until we get to the Enlightenment. That is when we start looking at really specific parts of theory, and I will be making sure that you're well aware of that as we get there. All right. So let's start off with a list of the 4 or 5 or 6, maybe it's 6 now, trends, time periods, and the trends that came along with them. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to look at is what's known as the classical Greek era. The classical Greek era is really a debate amongst the philosophers. And by the way, this is Western thought. I forget to say that a lot, and I shouldn't. This is Western thought, okay? This is not taking into account any Eastern considerations at all whatsoever. And that's partly our history and why most of it comes from men and et cetera, et cetera. I want to acknowledge our biases of this course of study. Not ours, we're not responsible for it, but the biases that we have as we look back on the history of something, and looking at the development of rhetorical theory, we're looking backwards, and hindsight's literally 2020. So in this case, so we will not be pretending that this is a multicultural, intercultural, interdisciplinary, range of thought, so much as it's just Western history of persuasion. Okay, so please keep that in mind. So we start off in where all of Western civilization tends to start its real level of knowledge, which is with the classical Greeks. So, who are we talking about in the classical Greeks? We're talking about Plato, Aristotle, the sophists. Actually, we're always talking about the sophists, they're always there. Isocrates, okay? We're talking about those guys. During this time period, we were still trying to sort out as humans not just why things happen, like where thunder comes from, which of course for the Greeks was from Zeus, right? But where we weren't trying to figure out through what we would call today a scientific method, but there was a method to their understanding of the world, to their learning. And that method was known as dialectics. Dialectics is essentially the back and forth that one might do to come to an answer about two competing ideas. Now, do we use this for everyday science, like the things you experience, like, oh, I woke up and I breathed in? No. For the things that are knowable, the things that are absolutely knowable through our five senses, so empirically, we have more senses than that, but you get the idea. Empirically, or if it's knowledge of things that are considered more ethical or moral or social in nature. So we don't focus on the sort of scientifically proven or empirically proven things. We know those things. We agree that those things are true. We agree that the sun will come up tomorrow, right? In whatever that means. We understand that, and they did too. But the questions of how should we behave socially towards others, how should we, or how do we persuade people to work with us instead of against us? How do we get people to agree more often than they disagree? How do we do this with a level of civility that preserves the relationship as much as it preserves the end goal? Where does all of that fit in? That was the debate during the classical Greek period. You're talking about the debate between philosophy, right? Which is what, the study of life generally, and truth. How do we come to know? All right. So we get this real debate there. And a lot of these theorists that we call philosophers wrote about a lot of things. Obviously, that's why we call them philosophers. But we're going to focus on where they talk about rhetoric, persuasion, ethics of sort of the social communicative world that we live in. Okay, so that's the classical Greeks. The classical Romans come about 200 years after the classical Greeks in our course of study. And here we have two main theorists, Cicero and Quintilian. And in this world, we're looking at the relationship between rhetoric and power. You know, and if we want to look at ancient Greece as really a great debate between rhetoric and truth, I think that's a valid trend. Rhetoric versus truth. And then in the Roman period, we're looking at the relationship between rhetoric and power. How rhetoric can uphold or destroy social institutions such as leadership, such as government, such as community activities, such as social ideas and order. And so that's sort of the classical Romans. We move very quickly into the Dark Ages, obviously after the fall of the Roman Empire. And what are the Dark Ages really? Referred to as the medieval period. We could break these down a couple different ways. For those of you out there who are big history buffs, please correct me if I get this wrong, because I won't lie, this time period is not my best. But during this time period, which can range from anywhere from about 800 years to about 1600, I think most people place it right around 1200 years, sometime between 300 CE and really like, what, 14 or 1500 CE. So really that's sort of what I gauge as the medieval period or the Dark Ages. Why is it called that again? Because there wasn't a lot of scientific process. I get that. Progress, excuse me. And there weren't. I mean, there wasn't a lot of scientific progress because we didn't know how to do science was the first reason. But another reason was because, to be honest with you, the Catholic Church, and I say that because it's historically true. The Holy Roman Empire was called that because the Pope reigned over political as well as religious order. Okay, so everything was based on what the Holy Roman Catholic Church said, and if you spoke out against that, you were considered a heretic. You might be put on trial. You might be beheaded. It just depended on where in the medieval period we were. And so everything that we needed to know was already given to us through the Bible and the teachings of the church. That's all we needed to know. That made things very clear-cut and simple. And the need for the study of rhetoric pretty much went away. Because if we didn't have people who were trying to convince us of something, but just said, we know this to be true because it's in the Bible. We know this to be true because the church says it's true. When you get to that point where you have an authority like that, a one authority, and again, Western thought, Western meaning, Europe, all the way over to us eventually, but the Western thinking, we based everything on the dictates of the church. Now, if you've seen any movies like Robin Hood with Kevin Costner, which I know is way dating me, or if you've watched any of the movies that address the medieval period, really Game of Thrones, let's be honest, that's when it occurred. If it were going to occur, that's sort of the setting of it, where politics were very tenuous, and so the church just took over. And that's where all of our knowledge comes from, all of our understanding, all of our rules and regulations, social organization. In fact, we were so organized that we had what was known as the feudal system. For those of you who don't know what the feudal system is, it's that system of, you have serfs working the land who are on I forget what a fiefdom, maybe? And those were overseen by knights, and the knights reported to the lords and ladies, and the lords and ladies reported to the king and queen, and the princesses and princes. And we had this very, very dictated class and social system. And it was that way for a long time. So your entire family, for generations, generations, may have worked the same piece of land for the same people, the same family for generations, as I said. And that meant that you didn't see anything outside of that world. You didn't experience anything outside of that world. Everything that you needed was right there in front of you. And so you didn't need to travel. You didn't need to become worldly. You didn't need culture. In the early Dark Ages, you just needed to be able to work the land and do what you were told by whomever. All right. So during that time period, not a lot of exploration was going on of truth. Truth came from God. That was that. So there are not a lot of works during this time period that we study. One of the other reasons for that is because of the link between power and rhetoric. The more, we'll talk more about this in detail, but essentially the rule is the more dispersed power is, the greater the need you have for understanding rhetoric, right? In a democracy, we have decentralized power. It's spread out amongst everybody. Well, it's spread out again across many people as opposed to just one, right? One person in charge would be more of authoritarian rule, dictatorships, etc., right? And in those situations, when you have somebody with the rules up here, handing them down, you don't need to do a lot of questioning of that. You don't participate in the process of making those rules and regulations. So The reason that this is focused on the Western world at this point in time, for a very, very long time, was because it only really worked in democratic or decentralized powers, and there weren't many of those in the Eastern world at the time and for much of our history. Okay, so there were really two reasons why there was a hyper focus on Western philosophy for so long, and then of course the church dictated that it be that way as well. So there are a few others, but St. Augustine is our main concern. He is around 400 CE. And St. Augustine was obviously a Catholic saint eventually. So he was a preacher, a priest in the Catholic Church, sort of, kind of, a monk, I believe he decided to become. But prior to that, and for most of his life, he was a pagan. He was a sophist. He taught people how to practice rhetoric. He practiced rhetoric himself and was paid heavily for it. And when his mother, Monica, prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed for him to become a Christian, and he did late in life, he wrote two works that are considered his most well-known, I think, at least in Western philosophy. The first is known as the Confessions, and the second is known as On Christian Doctrine. In the Confessions, that's much more of a, here's what I've done wrong and I feel so bad about it, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway. Sort of that, grant me patience, Lord, but hurry sort of writing. And in the Confessions, he basically just says, here's what all the things I've done, and they're bad. What we're most interested in is On Christian Doctrine because it talks about how in an authoritarian system, such as at the time the church, how in that authoritarian system rhetoric can function to help the system. So he was applying rhetoric in a very centralized power situation. And he was talking about how that could be done. And that's a fascinating, interesting way of looking at rhetoric within the context of an authoritarian system, for lack of a better description of the church at the time. Okay. Now, that becomes important also because he says that rhetoric is not inherently evil. It's not something that challenges God. It's not an expression of pride, although all those things can happen. They don't happen because of rhetoric. They happen because of the person. So the practice of trying to persuade people is something that we absolutely have to do in the church, according to St. Augustine. And basically throughout the Middle Ages, that is the extent of a commentary on rhetoric, at least by name. We will later go on to study two women, Christine de Pizan and Margaret Fell, who also worked within the confines of the church, but not as priests or nuns or any of that thing. They weren't officially a part of the church, but they did, of course, live in that context. Okay, but they still learned to function in society while teaching women and talking and addressing men about why women should be able to speak in certain contexts, or how women can help, honestly, men. I mean, this is, again, historical, right? How women, for the most part, can help men move forward in power or gain more power. Okay, so fascinating stuff, at least. For something that has absolutely no development in it, I certainly spend a lot of time talking about it. And that's because it literally, I mean, if we're looking at a timeline between about 500 BCE to 2021, that's a long time. Don't get me wrong, but that's what, 2,500 years? I mean, when you think about it, it's really not that big of a number, but especially when you consider that half of that, by conservative estimates, half of that was spent in the Dark Ages. So that time period in the Western world, at least, had a great impact on our scientific development, our understanding of how we come to know things, our understanding of truth, and so on. And that, of course, led to the birth, to rebirth, especially all over Europe, Russia, etc. We're talking about, we're talking about the Renaissances, right? In these different places. They were not all at once, just so we're all clear on that. There was not a Renaissance, there were multiple Renaissances going on. And yes, that is the proper plural, believe it or not. So if you're someone who is thinking that, oh, all Renaissance, the Renaissance was all of Europe and it was from this year to this year, no, that's incorrect, right? There were ideas about art, science, storytelling, social events, scientific discovery that sort of started to be born or reborn in the Renaissances as people started to question whether or not the Bible and God was and the church was the only place where we could get answers. Along came an entire course of study, people who labeled themselves or identified with the humanist movement, which, by the way, does not believe that humans are more important than anything else and only humans can answer questions. It just means that humans can contribute almost as much as anything else. And obviously, for some people, humans are the only contributors to understanding the human world. They don't buy into any mysticism or religion or alien description, just relying on human beings' observations of the world and practices within the world, all the way up to people who believe that God has most of the answers, but human beings have to interpret them, right? So this idea that human beings have some autonomy, some efficacy in understanding their world, in being able to comment on the world, in not trapping ourselves by saying, here's the ceiling of things that we can know. They decided they wanted to explore more, so we get the invention of things like the telescope, right, and rulers and compasses and measurements, etc., utilizing astronomy for the purpose of understanding geography, and so forth. So the Renaissances, as they sort of pop up, like I'm doing these hand motions, right? I mean, it's not just because I'm Italian. It's also because, we're popping up Renaissances all over, rebirths. Like, it's sort of a visual, if you want. Imagine that the Dark Ages were black and white, and then all of a sudden color starts popping up all over Europe. Sort of picturing it that way. That's the way I usually end up looking at it. I think part of the problem is that my husband's taken me to about 3 too many Renaissance festivals, possibly 20 too many Renaissance festivals. And so I always see these bright colors and these people who are selling potions, or magical things. But at the same time, people who are talking about the development of foods or the sharing of cultural ideas as well. So that's how I sort of mentally, metaphorically think about it. And what that led to is what we call the Enlightenment, which, of course, I don't know about anybody else, but whenever somebody says Enlightenment, like a light bulb appears, like physically, it gets brighter to me. That idea that during the Enlightenment, through these Renaissances, we learned how to come to know the world better. And in the Enlightenment, we started actually scientifically exploring the world. We started describing things to people. There was a birth of education. Did I say birth? A burst of education, of more people being educated, of a different educational system from the classical Greek and Roman education systems, and started opening it up. And the practice of rhetoric became important because, let me ask you a question. If you're going to do, not that you can answer, if you're going to do a scientific experiment and you're going to tell people, here's what the result of my scientific experiment is, you need to understand how rhetoric works in order to be able to do that. Which is, by the way, if you're looking for an example of this, the entire coronavirus and the vaccine for coronavirus, all of that discussion is science that is being presented to us rhetorically. And the rhetoric of science during the Enlightenment was a big deal. How is it that we talk about or share the knowledge of this in-depth scientific work and research that we've done? How do we express what we've come to know? And during the Enlightenment, this was actually a question. And when we get into Bacon and Vico and a few others, you'll learn that the fact that we have all these advertisements right now for prescription drugs that list every side effect possible, which is annoying to us, but at the same time, people say it's absolutely necessary in order for people to understand completely what they're getting themselves into. So teaching people how to understand the rhetoric of science. So during the medieval period, we really have a struggle between the church and rhetoric, right? And then we start to have a questioning through the Renaissances that leads to the Enlightenment, where we really have a tension between three things: rhetoric, science, and I'm putting that in air quotes because at the time, science and reasoning were sort of interchangeable words. That idea of deductive reasoning was considered science and scientific, and I'm not saying that's wrong or bad, but it's different from the way that we think about science now, okay? So science and reasoning, and then rhetoric. So the aesthetic. Wow, let me try that again for you. We have three things that are in tension during the Enlightenment. We have rhetoric, we have science and reasoning, and then we have finally the aesthetic, which is the artistic, the creative. Can poetry be rhetorical? Can poetry use science? Can science learn anything from narrative? How do these three things relate to each other? Are they linked? Should they not be linked? And so on. So those are sort of the questions surrounding the Enlightenment, and we could see why it's much more complex. From the Enlightenment, once we started to sort out what we believed that we knew from what we didn't know, what science was versus what reasoning was, we move into what we call the modern period. And the modern period really is about finding the most functional way of dealing with our lack of knowledge or the knowledge that we gain. Functional furniture was even a thing, right? Mid-century modern people who are interested in that aesthetic will understand clean lines, very box-like, very functional things that were occurring during that time. The aesthetic was not ornamental at all, very much just about how do I get from A to B? How do I sit in a chair that's comfortable, but doesn't take up too much space? Not invasive on the space, but functional. Clocks were very streamlined. Dining room tables, wrought iron, etc. Paintings were very, very clear, and didn't really start to contrast until about the 1960s. Where, of course, we start to see hints at what we call the postmodern period. And the postmodern period and, what we call the postmodern period, I don't really like that term. I feel like modernism and postmodernism coexist right now. And I mean, I don't necessarily mean in one person, but in sort of the worldview of things, we're definitely leaning towards a more postmodern world where it's not just about function, but it's about understanding and it's about the aesthetic as well. But it's where truth can be more relative, because it usually is when it comes to human beings who are the most unpredictable variable in all of the world that I know or understand. So we are sort of in that right now. We want our science to be to be very modern. We want to know very cleanly that A leads to Z, right? We don't care what B through Y are. We're just more concerned with the beginning and the end. But a postmodern view might take stops along the way to make sure or to question how it's happening. All right. So we have the classical Greeks, rhetoric versus truth. We've got the classical Romans, rhetoric versus power. We've got the medieval period, and that is rhetoric versus the church for the most part. Then we have the Renaissances, which bring up a rebirth of a lot of things that lead into the Enlightenment, where we find a tension between rhetoric versus science and reasoning versus the aesthetic, that which is pleasing to the eye or artistic. Then we move into the modern period, where everything is extremely functional and non-ornamental, and into the postmodern period, where there may not be just one single truth and one single function, but instead is a little bit more of a more complex process of learning, of finding truth, of persuading. All right. So those are the main areas that we're going to be looking at chronologically speaking, and those trends are what we're interested in the most. Within those trends will be a group of theorists who are debating them or presenting them or even answering them in some cases, proposing how humans learn, how humans should think, how humans should look for truth, what truth is, where it comes from, how we think about it, and so on. These will all be questions that we address as we go through this history of rhetoric. Now, you're asking the question, why the hell do I care? And the answer to that question is, you care because once we get through all this, you're going to understand answers to questions you didn't even realize you were asking. For example, why is it that fake news is a thing? And what is that? Where does it come from? And how can we change that? How do we evaluate it? And how do we not engage it? These are all questions currently a lot of us have, right? What is the credibility of a speaker, Dr. Fauci, for example, or Biden, or the Vice President Harris, or whatever? How do we evaluate their credibility? The former President Trump. How do we evaluate whether they're telling us the truth or not? Those are all questions that we've been asking since Aristotle. And we find some ways of coming to answers about them, at least individually. So as we go through this chronology in 8 weeks, which is short, again, I say, we're hopefully going to find some answers to questions that we're even asking now. So hopefully this helps give you a good introduction as to what you need to know about rhetoric, I should say COM 350, about the course itself, how we're going to go about it, tackling a very large subject in a very short period of time, what your main assignments are, and of course, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, etc., you can email me. I'm terrible at email. But a lot of times what people do is they email me and then they send me a text saying, hey, I sent you an email. Can you look at it? Because I get so many emails that they do sometimes end up in my bulk folder. Sometimes they end up in a junk folder without me wanting to. Even ones that come from MissouriState.edu makes 0 sense. Agreed. But I can lose emails very easily, and I'm admitting that wholeheartedly. And it's not always my fault. Let's just put it that way. But sometimes I'm sure it is. So what I want you to do is email me if you want to, and we'll start there, and hopefully I'll get right back to you. If not, I'm going to need you to send me a text. Or if you just want to go directly to texting, that's fine too. The cell phone number that's on the syllabus is my cell phone number. All you have to do is text or call, tell me who you are at the beginning of the text or the call, so that I know who I'm talking to, that I'm talking to a student, etc. But ask whatever questions you need to ask. We'll talk, we'll set up meetings, we'll do whatever we need to. And so email and texting, that's your best way. And if you're worried about, oh, well, I didn't want to wake you up in the middle of the night because I was working at, 3 o'clock in the morning. First of all, don't worry about that. I used to do that myself. But second of all, if my phone does not wake me up, that means I turned it off, the ringer. And I do that when I go to sleep at night. Okay, so don't worry about waking me up or interrupting my life. Just go ahead and send the text or make the call. And if I'm busy, I will ignore it until I can get to it. which is usually within hours if you text me, within 48 hours if you email me, hopefully sooner. And so always, always, always feel free to use that phone number. And now I'm going to post a bunch of videos for you to watch that hopefully go along with your readings. I believe that they do. And let's get this started and get it over with for some of you, right? I'm going to enjoy myself, but hopefully some of you will too. All right, I'll be in touch. You keep in touch, and we're going to have a great summer together.